Hi everyone, this is Dr. Strickland, and I want to talk a little bit about middle to late childhood in our next video lecture series. So let's start with the ages in middle to late childhood. Now I know in your readings it went middle and then it kind of just jumped to adolescence, but for us in the field of research we like early, middle, late, so we can kind of departmentalize all the different areas that are being affected within each of these age ranges. Okay, so let's start with the ages. Again, in human growth and development, what is nice is that you can compartmentalize not only the stages, but you can think of it also in ages. Like I said in the previous video, anytime somebody walks up and says, my child, I say, what age? Because again, I'm going to go to that specific stage and I'm going to know what happens in each of the different ages. And so therefore, I am ready to answer that person's questions, depending, on if it's physical, if it's cognitive, or if it's social emotional. So think about middle to late childhood is the ages between 6 to 12. And another, way of thinking about it is to think, okay, this is the elementary school years. And when you think about it, this is the elementary school years. They maybe went to preschool, possibly kindergarten, but first grade starts the grade. And so once they enter into the school system and into the grades, that they're going to be influenced by other environments besides the home environment. So you think about the majority of time that kids actually spend in school on a daily basis. That's an enormous amount of influence that's non-shared compared to shared environments within the home and maybe even with other siblings as well. So when you think about some of the physical developments, let's start with basically height and weight, because those are the questions that people ask. As with early childhood development, height continues 2 to 3 inches a year. But do take into consideration if there are any congenital issues going on with that child, that may have a play on the actual average of inches each year. Weight, about 5 pounds a year. So even though growth is continuing, it is starting to slow down just a little bit. But there are areas, physical areas in the body, when you're thinking about height and weight, that are taking place. First of all, skeletal system. You think about how the skeletal system is starting to develop and refine itself and to solidify bones. As with teeth, losing teeth in early childhood, this continues to progress to permanent teeth in middle to late childhood. So we see skeletal growth, we see muscle growth. And one thing to keep in mind about height and weight is that now you're starting to look at how culture, here we go back to culture, and ethnicity, race, can also have an effect on the varying level of height and weight for each individual child. So do take into consideration culture, take into consideration ethnicity and race. That also now in middle to late childhood has an effect. Nutrition is going to be one of those areas that parents have to make sure that they're following, because nutritional gains is a huge factor now that some children are eating breakfast now out of the home, they're eating lunch now out of the home. So parents have to take into consideration that nutritional gains and needs may not be adequate compared to early childhood when you had more, I don't want to say control, but more influence, and I guess I would say control of what the child is eating. So that always plays into it. They need around 1,200 to 2,000 calories a day, but again, you look at those nutritional needs. Some kids are not getting enough nutritional needs during the day, maybe in the school environment, and so therefore parents, may have to supplement with other areas. There's different types of juices, there's just different types of drinks. All of that has to be followed to make sure that your child is developing height and weight. Now, there was a study that I actually read several years ago that showed that at the end of childhood, so we go through early, middle, late childhood, at end of 12, getting into adolescence, that those children who lived in poverty, especially extreme poverty, were on average around 2 inches shorter. So what does that tell you about the importance of environment and how environment plays such a vital role in development? Some other things that you might see change is sleep. Sleep may start to change, and again, they're watching TV, they're interacting, they're gaming. My son was a gamer, and he's actually played with a kid who was 8, and you know that their time frames and their clocks are completely different. So again, sleep starts to change just a little bit. You know, they may not want to sleep as much, or you know, their sleeping changes from staying up later till in the morning. So you think about how sleep factors into that as well. So some of the same variables in early childhood continue in middle to late childhood, but you're also looking at other factors like accidents. As you know, that bones start to solidify, skeletal growth, kids are getting into sports. All of us started sports and activities in this particular age, especially around 5 or 6. So, you know, activities are affecting, you know, how accidents will, you know, come around, and to the extent of these accidents. You think about childhood cancers. That's something you have to factor in. One of the leading cancers in childhood is leukemia. Not only early child, but we see it between the ages of 6 to 12. So there's, again, it's almost like it builds on this platform of early childhood. Now that they're influenced by all these other environments, you know, this is going to affect their well-being and, of course, their overall effect on growth as well. So again, you look at height and weight, 2 to 3 inches a year, 5 pounds. You think nutrition is going to be a big factor. You think about activities, sports, outdoors. But there is an issue that we do have in middle to late childhood, and that is obesity. And we do have issues with childhood obesity in this country. You know, here's a saying that, you know, if your child is obese at 6 and you do something about it, you start to plan activities, outdoor activities, you watch nutritional growth. You know, there's maybe a 25% chance they may be obese as an adult. But by the end of early childhood or middle to late childhood, if your child is obese at 12, you just increase that to a 75% chance that they will become obese as an adult. So you've got a 6-year window period to really influence, because again, they're outside of the home, the overall physical development of that child. So again, you're looking at more accidents. You know, you're looking at activities that they're doing, what influences their development is so important. When you think about cognitively, what's developing cognitively, believe it or not, gray matter is starting to condense just a little bit. Now, some people say, oh, that's horrible. How do I reverse it? No, it's not. Because the neurons that have not made any connections, that are just sitting there without dendrites, those connections, they will start to prune themselves out. And so if you don't use it, you don't need it. And so kids at this particular age will start pruning out those neurons that they don't need. So the neurons that are left in that gray matter, they're going to strengthen even more. And one of the most important areas that we see in brain development with young kids is the white matter. Now, if you remember, if you've had anatomy physiology, that white matter is that fatty coating that encases that axon. And axon is how messages are sent. That is the firing mechanism. And as that develops, and it develops through adolescent, speed is faster. How they process information is faster. Attention is affected. So we see that myelin sheath, that myelination, start to increase, and it's an enormous amount of development within that white matter. So again, gray matter starts to condense down just a little bit, only because if you're not using the neurons, they're just there, they're not being used. So now growth can focus on the neurons that are there and focus on the speed and reaction of those neurons. So that is important brain development. 2 other areas that we see is the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobes are your auditory cortex, and the parietal lobe, which is body sensation. So you think about how they're picking up on language, how they're developing language, how they're processing information, and how they act to that information. So it's kind of like, you know, thinking and hearing and language and acting at the same time. So the movements are becoming more refined. Remember that word that I mentioned to you in early childhood, asynchronous? And I gave you an example how, you know, physical development can be different from emotional development, can be different from cognitive. You think now all the lobes are starting to come together and they're starting to communicate. So that asynchronous is starting to become synchronous as they develop through late childhood. So all of this information is going on in the brain, and they are like little sponges. They start to have special areas that they like. I asked this in my class the other day, and when you were in grade school, can you remember what your favorite subjects were? Most mentioned science and history and reading. Kids really, I think, they really like to read. They're really involved in reading. And they start getting into specific subjects. Remember, in early childhood, it's that magical thinking and fairy tales, my favorite. But in middle to late childhood, we have seen that they kind of move out of that phase just a little bit, and they want more realistic stories. They want examples of kids like themselves. They want role models. They want to start to identify who their real self is, and that's part of that emotional development. And so now they're kind of moving away from the fairy tales. I mean, some of us don't, but some do, and they're getting into more realistic story. And they're having favorites, or they're liking things. And again, whatever they start to influence them in early childhood can actually continue to develop and grow as they go through middle and late childhood. So cognition is a huge factor in the fact that they're becoming more interested in subjects. They're becoming more interested in learning, interested in reading. That development is there, and what we move to, according to Jean Piaget, is concrete operational thinking. And concrete operational thinking begins around the age of 7, according to Piaget. And the best way I've always explained concrete information. So, in early childhood, I mentioned if I had asked a 4-year-old where the toys are, I don't know, in a store, and I say, tell me where the toys are in I don't know, Target, and the child's going to grab my hand and he's going to take me there. Okay, so now we move to concrete operational. If I ask a 8-year-old, where are the toys in Target, he's probably going to say, all right, listen, Miss Robin, you're going to go through the door, you're going to go straight until you see the shoes, and I'm going to go, wait a second, I need to go get a card. No, you have to go this way to get to the toys. So what happens is, in concrete thinking, they think within the box. That they have to know one way to get to something before they can tell you alternative ways, or abstract thinking, to get to the toys. So they're going to give you specific directions. They're learning specific directions. They're learning seriation. They're learning a sequence. They're learning categorization. They're learning that you can reverse objects. They're learning that even though you take one glass of water and it's tall, you can pour it into another glass. You haven't changed the amount of water, you just changed the shape that the water is being held in. So kids are starting to understand those processes, but they're learning a way of doing it. One way that I helped my son with concrete operational was I taught him how to cook. I said, he loves brownies. Both my kids like brownies. And when they were 8 or 9, I told my son, I said, well, why don't you learn how to make the brownies? You have to learn kind of a sequence of how things are done. And that was thinking within the box. You preheat the oven, you grease your pan, you get out the eggs. That was kind of a sequencing in how they learn how to do things. Once they learn, as they develop and that brain develops, then there's many different ways to get to toys in stores. There's many different ways to get home. There's many different ways to grandmother's house. So they go from that concrete thinking, what is the knowledge, what is real, this is the way we have to do it, and that will evolve into the next stage of Piaget when you think of formal operational. So as you can see, even from a qualitative process, kids are learning, they're interacting in their environment, they're developing in their grades. Kindergarten, first and second grade, kids are learning how to read. By third grade, they're reading to learn. Now they have to have those reading skills. And so all of this is a process, again, that's 6 through 12, those elementary school years. And we also tend to notice, usually by third or fourth grade, if kids are having some difficulties, not just behavioral or emotional difficulties, but also if they're having what we consider learning disabilities. Now again, that kind of gets into my area of clinical psychology, but we do actually see that. One of the most diagnosed in this particular age, especially between 7 to 10, is what you have probably heard of as ADD or ADHD. And this is considered, in our neurodevelopmental area, a learning disability. And when you think about ADHD, it is a process of how they process that information. And we know based on research that kids with ADHD process what they see visually at a faster speed than someone who's not ADHD. They see it, and they go on to the next thing. That's why you may have heard that kids with ADHD or ADD who game can literally sit there for 4 to 5 hours playing a game. Why? If you've seen how these games work, and I have a gamer son, that is very fast information. That's very fast processing. But some studies have shown that kids who do game do respond quicker to stimuli. They can make decisions and process information at a faster rate. So now they're even encouraging people outside of the gaming world that gaming may actually be good for you. I know you gamers just love that right now. And I told my son, he's like, yes, I told you. And even from a behavioral standpoint, even from an emotional behavioral standpoint, because not all kids from this age are going to develop emotionally at the same. That showed that even gaming can actually lower some aggression in kids as well. So you can see overall that this is just, again, an enormous amount of development between 6 to 12 is preparing children as they progress through the grade levels, as they gain that knowledge in certain subjects, that is preparing them, just say it's preparing them for the foundation to move into adolescence. And so whatever happens from a physical perspective, cognitive, or an emotional is so important, that it will kind of define in the beginning how they're going to transition into this kind of transitional period of adolescence. And it is so important because we do see more behavioral problems in this particular age than we see other types. And yes, and I have been asked, kids can have anxiety in this stage. They can. And we have childhood depression. And it's things that you need to notice. A child with depression is very different and displays symptomology very different than an adult. And sometimes parents don't pick up on it because they assume that they're not showing adult symptoms. So a child that may be displaying depression may complain about ailments like their stomach's hurting all the time, or their head's hurting, or they don't feel good. They may be increasingly irritable. They may start to have difficulty eating, maybe not being hungry, start to have increased sleep issues. But one of the first signs you're going to see is kind of that decrease in activity, and maybe not an interest in activities. Maybe grades starting to show. If they really, really liked reading, or they really like science, and now you're starting to see their grades go down, or they're starting to have behavioral problems in the classroom. We see not only ADHD, but if that's not dealt with, it can move to what we call oppositional defiant disorder, where they start to become defiant with school officials and authority figures. And once they get out in the community and they start getting in trouble, then we kind of move towards what we call conduct disorder. So again, it's a very important developmental stage, and parenting is so important for that support. Activities in the community. I'm very fortunate, and my kids were, where we grew up, that we had kind of a center where they could go and they could get involved in sports, and they can do activities year round. That's really important. So they're starting to change that kind of ideal self, and from early childhood, where they would say, okay, I'm like Dora, I'm like the Red Ranger, to now it's within. Now they're defining themselves by the groups that they're in, by how many friends that they have, how many parties they're invited to. So there's just a lot going on within this developmental stage. So I hope that's given you some ideas to kind of think back on this particular stage. Next, I will be moving towards adolescence. But again, the questions that people can ask you vary so much. I think my child may have a weight problem, or he's not eating, or he's not sleeping. How do I get him to sleep more? Or he doesn't have, many friends, or I think my child's depressed, or I think my child might be dealing with anxiety, or is there an ADHD problem? You're just seeing a lot more because there's more environmental influences now within that development. So I hope that's helped you out, and our next stage will be adolescence. That's a great stage. All right, bye.